Good afternoon. We hope you enjoyed your lunch. It's my pleasure to introduce Ron Dennis. As an avid pursuer of family history, I'm anxious to hear his talk. I was just telling him we're trying to get our Maddocks connected to Wales. So Ron Dennis is a BYU Professor Emeritus of Portuguese and Welsh. He's the author of several books about the history of the church in 19th century Wales, including translations and commentaries of 10 volumes of Welsh Mormon periodical begun by Dan Jones in 1846. He has a website, Welsh Mormon History, and the English translation of all of Dan Jones' pamphlets are posted on his website, as well as the 30 issues of the first periodical published by Jones. Dennis has created a free app for pre-MTC missionaries that are going to Brazil with the Brazilian Portuguese language. And he has several publications out on our speaker table. So it's my pleasure and interest to hear from Ron Dennis.
Thank you. Thank you. It's never a sacrifice to talk about Welsh Mormon history. That's what I've done for a lot of years, and I even had to take tour groups to Wales to have people captive on a bus, so I'm glad to have you here, that I can make a few comments about the missionary work of Dan Jones. I begin my presentation with a picture of the title page of Female Life Among the Mormons. This may not seem like it has a lot to do with the presentation, but the connection is that the Welsh translation of several chapters of this anti-Mormon novel were printed in serial form in 1855 in Ramserai, the Times, which was a Welsh language newspaper published in North Wales. And this drew an immediate response from Dan Jones. Am I pointing at that one? There we are. Dan Jones was the editor of Zion's Trumpet, Idgorn Zion. It was the Mormon periodical then in its 9th year of publication in South Wales. Dan Jones was at the time back in Wales on his second mission. He devoted a total of 16 pages in 2 issues of his periodical to an article he entitled "The Times with its Carcass in its Mouth." And I'll explain that. And declares the novel to be a dirty bag and the filthiest of all the anti-Mormon literature he's ever read. He compares its many lies about Mormonism to a dead carcass and declared his surprise when he saw that the editor of the Times, whom he portrays as a bird of prey, had taken hold of the carcass with his teeth, sucking the sap, this is a quote, sucking the sap, maggots, and all down to his greedy gut, almost to the point of bursting his stomach. Here's what it sounds like in Welsh, in case you're interested. There it is. Hyd nes gweled golygydd yr amserau wedi cydio yn yr ysgrybwd a'i ddanydd ac yn signo I sigyn cyntron ar cyfan I lawr y gylla gwancius hyd braidd dorri vola. Had you previously been under the misconception that Welsh and English have a connection, now you know that there's none. Now, further on in the article, Jones wrote, "The editor of the Times proves himself totally unfit to edit any publication and unworthy of the trust of the public by lowering himself with his shameless stream of lies." And you should hear him when he really gets angry. Jones also reprimanded Mr. Lloyd, "Every editor should understand what is true and what is not true, better than to lift up some disgusting posy like this," referring to the novel, Female Life Among Mormons, "to the wind to move away the disgrace that Mormonism has brought on the nation of the Welsh. That would be the same thing as for the chimney sweep to attempt to clear away the soot from off the face of the sun." Then Jones proposes a remedy for the editor. "We believe that the best way to cleanse the dirty things from the stomach of the Times would be to give it a dose of these pills," referring to the clarifications that he was giving in his response, "once in a while until the purging and the puking diminish." Now, Dan Jones is well known in Mormon history as the captain of the steamboat. Here's the steamboat, a sketch of it, the Maid of Iowa, And he was with the prophet Joseph Smith the night before the martyrdom in Carthage jail. And of course, he was a recipient of the last recorded prophecy of Joseph Smith, which was that Jones would actually live through the events of Carthage and yet serve the mission that he'd been called to almost a year before. President Gordon B. Hinckley says, in terms of the number of converts, Dan Jones must certainly be included in the half dozen or so most productive missionaries in the history of the church. Now, sometimes Dan Jones is confused with Daniel W. Jones. Don't do that. They're two different people. Daniel W. Jones, the one on, well, you see the label, let's see, Dan Jones, yeah, he was in the, he assisted in the rescue of the handcart companies in 1856. Now, Dan Jones, 20 years older than Daniel W., crossed the plains that same year, but was with Franklin D. Richards and others, you might recall, in the carriage that preceded the handcart companies and actually sounded the alarm that they needed help. In the 36 hours following the martyrdom, he had 3 narrow escapes from death, was thus able to fill Joseph's prophecy that he would live. In fact, he ended up serving 2 4-year missions to Wales, but until recently, relatively few details have surfaced about these missions that would shed light on the way he became such a productive missionary. My objective this afternoon is to remedy, at least to some extent, this dearth of information. My sources are as follows. Dan Jones' journal. This is a wishful source and would be a treasure of information if I could find it. I know he kept one, or possibly several, but I have yet to locate it. 26 of his letters to file leaders in Liverpool and during his 2 missions were printed in the Millennial Star, so those are a good source. 20 of his handwritten letters, mainly to Brigham Young, but also some to Wilford Woodruff and George A. Smith, Thomas Bullock, are preserved in the Church History Library, and these have been a valuable resource. And a particularly helpful one in the positive side are a few letters written by admirers of Dan Jones, the missionary, and these help to round out his profile. In addition, we have scores of articles published in the various Welsh language religious periodicals, and they provide what his opponents viewed as the negative aspects of Dan Jones, and especially the evil of Mormonism. That was their main theme. And I will eventually provide English translations of all these articles on my website, and to access this website, just do a Google search, type in Welsh Mormon, and it's the only thing really that comes up. I felt very much alone in the work that I've done over the years. Now, of the greatest importance are the published writings of Dan Jones in defense of Mormonism, his numerous pamphlets and the periodical that he established in July 1846, a translation of which I have here. It's called The Prophet of the Jubilee, and you can see that he had a lot to write about in just 2.5 years, or 580 pages that he produced in this time period. And this was the first non-English periodical in the church. And his energetic response to Mr. Lloyd, the editor of the Times that I started off with, which I reviewed earlier, is just but a small taste of Dan Jones, the polemicist. He was the editor of the Welsh Mormon periodical for just under 5 years, a total of 1,728 pages. He also published 37 pamphlets, a total of 554 pages, and published a 288-page scriptural commentary, in all over 2,500 pages in Welsh. That's the downside. Good news is they've all been translated into English. Now, let us consider for a moment the opposition that he faced as he went back to Wales as a missionary. And this was only 2 years after his conversion, so he was relatively new in the church. Sermons were given regularly from the pulpits of the nonconformist chapels. Let me just explain what nonconformist means. It means they didn't conform to either Catholicism or to the Church of England, which is a Protestant church. Although the vicars of the Church of England preached against the Mormons, used their periodical, The Sun, to print a substantial number of anti-Mormon articles. So the opposition was coming from the Anglicans, but mainly from the nonconformists, especially the two Baptist publications. The nonconformists were like Methodists or Unitarians or Congregationalists, Independents, and especially Baptists, as we'll point out. Now, the editors of these periodicals refused to print any of Dan Jones's rebuttals. There are many episodes of disturbance, more opposition, of meetings held in homes of members, in pubs, rock throwing, name calling, interruptions, shouting, arrests, that sort of thing. And there were a few episodes of really serious physical aggression and many threats. In fact, just before he was coming back from Wales at the end of his first mission, he had to have round-the-clock protection because the threats were flying around because they didn't like the idea that here's this Welshman taking a bunch of Mormon converts to America, weakened the fabric, they felt, of Welsh society. David Jeremy, a convert from Carmarthenshire, was beaten so badly on one occasion by a mob that only the intervention from a very brave onlooker saved his life. So they had to deal with all of this sort of things. But Dan Jones kept a positive attitude. He declared in 1847 in a letter to Orson Spencer, "I delight in the trophies of war. I came here to fight for the spiritual freedom of my brethren, and I thank heaven and the God of this warfare that he is knocking off their shackles by hundreds." And this is before he'd baptized more, so later you could say by thousands. A few weeks later he wrote, "If Brother Spencer wishes to know the secret power of Welsh over English preaching," apparently Orson Spencer had asked that question, how do you get so many baptisms? He says, "Here it is. We fight hard for all we get, contend toe to toe and point to point for every inch of ground we gain. My lips keep moisture," he says, "and my lungs never tire, but just as ready now as ever, and my colors are firmly nailed to the masthead and will sink or swim on the deck of my Mormon bark." That was his determination to serve a good mission. Now, many of you will recognize this painting by Clark Kelly Price. This was commissioned by the Sons of the Utah Pioneers in 1993, now hangs in the Provo MTC, and it's also on page 1 of Preach My Gospel. And I believe the artist has captured, at least what I have in my mind, an accurate image of Dan Jones, the missionary, and certainly one that is consistent with the personality traits I've discovered about him in his writings and the writings of others about him, fearlessly and aggressively defending his belief in the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, this is William Howells. He's no doubt the greatest admirer of Dan Jones, whom he called his adored father in the gospel. I'll explain. In another letter to Orson Spencer, William Howells this time tells of his conversion to Mormonism. He says, "Having spent 20 years with the Baptist denomination seeking truth, but still in darkness until the reply of dear Brother Jones to the false accusations of a neighboring Baptist minister, vindicating the principles of the saints came to my hand, which in a few hours proved the religion I profess to be no other than a sound foundation. All my false hopes fled, all human traditions that I had cleaved to appeared folly. I was convinced that the saints were the only true church of God." So here's a person that is converted just by reading a pamphlet. And then he goes over to, from Aberdare, where he lived, to Merthyr Tydfil, talked with Dan Jones, got baptized that same night, went back to his church, and preached Mormon doctrine from the Baptist pulpit that next Sunday. He baptized, in the first year that he was a member, baptized over 100 converts, friends, family, and former parishioners. He was also the first Mormon missionary to France. John Taylor often gets that credit. It was actually William Howells that escorted John Taylor over to France, introduced him to some of his converts. When he was coming to America, there were 50 people on board the Olympus, his ship, that he baptized en route. And that's all the good news. Bad news is he died at a very young age, only 35, in 1851. Well, just quickly then, here are some things that William Howells had to say about Dan Jones. His sublime, generous, diligent spirit applied itself to new exertion continually as circumstances and experience opened an enlarged field for duty. And just a few more, and I'm only just picking out a few. Whoop, that was that one. Here they are. His clear head, good heart, solid sense, serious piety, his mind calm and dispassionate, remarkable for aptness, disposing his principles with clear methods, solid arguments adorned with words well chosen. Apparently could just do no wrong in the eyes of William Howells. His affection and humility on one hand, his resolution and courage on the other. And he caused the numerous religious sects of Wales, and this is the big advantage, that they all gang together, they all group together because in order to fight the common enemy, which was Mormonism, which had the gall to baptize some of their valuable people in their congregations. On one occasion, one minister's right-hand man decided that he'd had enough of the Baptist church and became a Mormon. Now, these reflections are from a lengthy letter by William Howells that was published in the Millennial Star, and here you can see the first page and a half. He goes on and on and on. He's the person you want to write your obituary for sure. And even another page. Those are all on my website. If you want to read all the good things about Dan Jones, you can. Now, by way of contrast, let us go to the Reverend Edward Roberts, a Baptist minister and one of Dan Jones' greatest detractors. So we have the really good and the really bad. The Reverend Roberts gave numerous anti-Mormon lectures in the Merthyr-Tydvil area in 1847, 1848. Here you see the Kyr Solemn Chapel. This is in Dowlies, about 2 miles from Merthyr-Tydvil, Baptist chapel. And this was the scene of the Reverend Roberts, his first lecture against Mormonism, September of 1847. Now, here's a review by a Baptist that thought the lecture was wonderful. He says, although it lasted for a few minutes, under 2 hours, all the listeners stayed attentive till the end, showing their approval in endless cheers, while the speaker continued, a better meeting was never had in Dowlies. That's the Baptist view. To get Dan Jones' take on it, a little different. He says, I seated myself in front. There he is in enemy territory on the front row. I took notes of his topics, and were you to see the fingers and eyes that evidently marked me as a gone case, you would have thought that I had 7 horns, if not as many heads, and every time that the harlequin would strike the pulpit with his paw and cry, down with Mormonism, in the midst of the echo of cheers, I had time and opportunity to inspect nearly all the eyes in the place. So here's Dan Jones right there, taking note, because he was going to lecture the next evening in response. Well, the Reverend Roberts spoke with great huil, which is the Welsh word meaning religious fervor and enthusiasm, as he threatened to kill Mormonism and bury it by Christmas. He didn't specify, however, the Christmas of which year. Now, here you see the title page. This is a response. This is his printed response, a 40-page pamphlet in which Dan Jones dissects, analyzes each one of the points that Roberts had tried to make. Now, reading this pamphlet is what caused William Howells to convert, the lay Baptist minister before. You'll notice that the English translation has been typeset to match the format as much as possible of the original. Now, I've used this procedure for nearly 6,000 pages of Welsh Mormon writings. I bet you didn't realize there were that many. That I've thus far translated from Welsh to English, and for want of a better term, I've called my procedure a facsimile translation. Can't be a true facsimile because that's the real thing, but it's a translation made to look like the typesetting of the original. So here's a brief comment from the preface of this pamphlet that reveals his feelings about the opposition and persecution he faced in Wales during the 8 years of his 2 missions. He says, the blasphemies and unfounded claims of Mr. Roberts are better for the spread of Mormonism than the stillness to be found in some other places. And while persecution and shame, although falling on myself, my brothers, are a means of spreading the truth in my dear country, welcome persecution, welcome pain, welcome shame. This is the exultant spirit that kept Dan Jones going for 8 years as a missionary. 1 4-year mission, went back later for another one. Now in his lecture, Roberts criticized Joseph Smith for having big hands, which signified that he lived well. Actually, I don't understand that interpretation. Dan Jones responded, "You workers of Dowlice," near Merthyr Tydfil, "remember to hide your hands in your pockets or somewhere out of sight of this reverend, or he will condemn you also as cheats as bad as Joe Smith." Now, to round out Dan Jones, the missionary, here's some basic information about him. Born in 1810, North Wales, small village of Halkin. He was one of 8 children, Thomas and Ruth Jones. His father was a bliner, or an elder with the Methodists, converted somewhere along the way. He probably worked in the lead mines, which is not good news. That's worse than working in a coal mine for your lungs. As a child, he went to sea at age 17, sailed the 7 seas for over a decade, came to America with his wife Jane in about 1840, and with a partner, Levi Moffett, he built a steamboat called the Maid of Iowa that you probably recognize if you know church history in Nauvoo period. And then he was baptized in the Mississippi River on the 19th of January, 1843. Now, the only words that I've found, since I haven't found his journal, that he wrote about his childhood are those stimulated by a visit to his beloved playground, boyhood playground, in 1855. He wrote them as part of an editorial in Zion's Trumpet, the Welsh Mormon periodical. Here's what he says. "Our mind ran back 30 years when on these very roads there sprightly played a 10-year-old lad. Angels of heaven around him would come. He perceived the light of the gospel, throng-like. He would gather the children of the town to the surrounding fields to instruct them in faith, repentance, baptism for forgiveness, and the gifts of the Holy Ghost as promised. He would be persecuted by all for this, and so he wandered across the seas, islands, continents of the world, seeking brethren the same belief, whom for his comfort an angel had promised him." So it kind of sounds like he'd had some experiences that told him there was something out there for him as far as the true religion. It was while operating the Maid of Iowa up and down the Mississippi River that Captain Dan Jones came to the knowledge of the restored gospel. In his 102-page History of the Latter-day Saints, which, by the way, is available in the bookstore, he provides some details of his conversion to Mormonism. He tells his own conversion story beginning on page 59. Copies are here available. This is what he wrote. He said, "We would thank this Sharp, Thomas Sharp, of course, the editor of the Warsaw Signal, for the information we got about the saints. For it was by reading his and others' accusations that our attention was drawn to them even before we saw them." So once Dan Jones had seriously investigated the doctrine of Mormonism, he was determined to align himself with the church. And then he was baptized Mississippi River in 1843, and about 3 months later, he took about 200 English converts, Nauvoo, from St. Louis, that had wintered in St. Louis. These were from England, and this was the occasion he first met Joseph Smith. There's a common misconception in church history that he met the prophet and he was so impressed he got baptized. No, he'd been a member for 3 months already. Now, when they first shook hands, Joseph said, "God help this little man." Welsh are not known for being tall. In fact, so many of them settled in Philadelphia that somebody declared if you lined up all the Welsh in Philadelphia, you'd have a line 5 miles long and 5 feet high. But there's probably a discrepancy in the height of Joseph Smith and Dan Jones, 6 to 8 inches. But they bonded quickly, and a month later, while Dan Jones was called on a mission to Wales, he didn't leave because Joseph Smith kept finding things for him to do with the Maid of Iowa, the steamboat. But Joseph Smith purchased half interest in the Maid of Iowa from Levi Moffett, who was Dan Jones' partner. The idea was that Joseph would soon purchase Dan's half, give him the money that would finance his mission back to Wales. But it wouldn't be until after the martyrdom, over a year later, that he finally got off on his mission. 2 weeks before the martyrdom, however, Joseph told Dan, "I have a check in the house for $1,200. As soon as I can get it cashed, you shall have 1,100 of it," a very sizable bunch of cash for that era, "and the start for Wales, not with your fingers in your mouth, but prepared to buy a press." Very important phrase, prepared to buy a press and do business aright. Now, a decade later, Dan Jones wrote to Thomas Bullock telling something about the martyrdom and also the Maid of Iowa. He said, Joseph never paid me the first dollar for the boat. But fortunately for his descendants, Dan Jones was philosophical about not receiving the money, and he said, thrilled with the prospects of my mission, I left all, rejoicing in the exchange of a steamboat for an eldership on the deck of the never-sinking ship of life. I've been glad that he did that, because I'm his daughter married a dentist, so I'm his great-great-grandson. Now, the phrase to buy a press is significant because it indicates that even before he went on his mission to Wales, this is what he had in mind. This is how he's going to combat the enemy. And you recall that Joseph Smith said in Carthage jail, you will see Wales and fulfill the mission appointed you ere you die. He did, escaped death 3 times, next 36 hours, and he was on his way back to Wales. His wife Jane accompanied him. Over here, that was the prophecy. And who was on that boat besides Dan Jones and his wife? It was Wilford Woodruff and his wife. They made their way to New York, 7th of December 1844. Then they left on the John B. Skiddy. And certainly along the way, I mean, you have a lot of time on a boat, not much is going on. I'm sure that the seasoned missionary Wilford Woodruff probably said something like, Dan, you're going to love your mission. I know I did mine. When I was in Benbow Farm, I had some really good experiences, and I can just imagine Dan Jones' eyes getting this big. Wow, that's what I want to do for Wales. So 8 weeks later, Dan Jones writes a letter to Wilford Woodruff that he was assigned to North Wales initially, and he said, I have neglected writing to you until now, expecting to have the better news to give you. That is, all those baptisms that Wilford Woodruff had. He was wanting, of course, himself. And he says, because I had some forebodings of glorious consequences. So I'm sure all these thoughts were filling his mind. And what a disappointment it was to him to spend his entire first year on his mission with 3 baptisms. He expected much more. Now, 7 weeks following his letter to Wilford Woodruff, on the 6th of April, 1845, Dan Jones spoke at a conference in Manchester. And here's the scribe. The remarks made a huge impression on him, and he wrote that Jones was ill. He had no baptisms to report. He spoke of Wales, a nation renowned in history. And this is a quote. He enlarged on the characteristics of his people in a manner and with an eloquence that told how ardently he loved his native tribe and his fatherland. The scribe continued. He told of his search for truth and how he had gained testimony of Joseph Smith. Also, he would not flinch from bearing a faithful testimony to the character of Joseph Smith. Well, finally, the scribe puts down his pen, and then he writes, we would here remark that we are utterly incapable of doing anything like justice to the address of Captain Dan Jones, for though delivered while struggling with disease, such was its effect upon ourselves, and we also believe upon others, that we ceased to write in order to give way to the effect produced upon our feelings. And now we have at least some idea as to the effect that his oratorical skills could have on others. And I can imagine him going up and down Wales, preaching out in the open or from behind the pulpit, having similar effect on many people. Now, here you see the very first pamphlet, the title page of his first pamphlet in Welsh. It's really a strange animal. Side by side is the English translation. And here are a few details of it. Preface is dated 4th April 1845. This is just 3 months after he got to Wales, and he has this 48-page pamphlet ready to go off the press, 48 pages in length, and he borrows heavily from Parley P. Pratt's Voice of Warning. But would you believe that in the pamphlet there's not one mention of Mormonism, and nowhere do you see the full name of the church in this pamphlet? I don't know why he did that. Maybe he was afraid of repercussions, but they would come. Then at the end of the year, a rebuttal was published, and it was called The Fraud of the Latter Saints, exposed in brief observations on the treatise which was written recently by Captain D. Jones. Now, let's just get an idea of the nature of Wales and how it fits into the total scheme of things. Here's a map of Britain. Keep in mind that Wales is 1/8 the size of Utah. 1/8. Not even a separate country. It's a principality of the United Kingdom. And here, more specifically, then you can see the outline of Wales. It's only about 120 miles from north to south and about 80 miles from east to west. It's not a big place. You can, if you look down in South Wales, you see Merthyr Tydfil, and this was the period of greatest growth during the 1840s and 1850s. Just so you know, Merthyr is a Welsh word for martyr. Tydfil is a girl's name. It's the name, according to legend, of a beloved princess who lived centuries ago, and she and her family were killed by marauders, and the town was named after her. Therefore, you have Merthyr Tydfil, meaning Tydfil the martyr. Now, here's a centuries-old Anglican church. That's the Church of St. Tydfil. Let's see, this map is a little clearer. Look down south. Let's see, where are you? Does that work? Well, you know basically where Merthyr Tydfil, Cardiff, Swansea, Carmarthen, all down in South Wales. And if you go to Merthyr Tydfil, you'll still see this still standing building about 100 yards from where the parish church is located. The long room up above, see where it says locomotive and railway inn. In that room, it's called the long room. That's where the Mormons met for several years, having not a chapel. By the way, there's this huge stake center that was built about 40 years ago. The one who dedicated it was President McKay, whose mother was born about a mile from where this is. And there were only 100 active members of the church at that time. It was big enough to be a stake center. So one of two things. Either President McKay was a man of great foresight, or he had a soft spot in his heart for the people in Wales and built this huge church for them. Probably a combination of both. Here is these are row houses. They're miners' cottages. This is where Dan Jones and his wife lived. They lived number 45. Don't know which one that was because it's quite a number of them. They're gone now, of course. Now, it was in mid-December 1845. He'd spent almost a year in North Wales. He's transferred down to South Wales, and here's some things that happened. He replaced William Henshaw. William Henshaw was from Cornwall, didn't speak a word of Welsh, but during his time there, over 400 people came into the church. This is William Henshaw's time. About 200 were baptized during 1845, which is really interesting because here's Dan Jones, native speaker of Welsh, and his English is flawless. He's up in North Wales. He baptizes 3 people. Here's this man from Cornwall down in South Wales. He and his missionaries bring in 200 people. I'm sure that he had him scratching his head wondering just how does this really work? And I think it has a lot to do with location. The assignment that Dan Jones had in South Wales meant that he was in charge of all missionary work, but he wasn't the only missionary. You had people like Abel Evans, who served a 7-year-long mission before he came to America. And Eliezer Edwards served an 8-year-long mission just after his conversion. So he had people like this that helped him full-time. But most men who served missions also had jobs and families to take care of as well. Men like William Phillips, Thomas Jeremy. In 3 years' time, Phillips would be the one to replace Dan Jones when he was released to come to America or bring a group of over 300 converts to America. And this Thomas Jeremy was a wealthy farmer that would pay the passage for quite a number of Welsh converts who were part of that first group of Welsh Mormons to emigrate. Because remember, back in 1849, it preceded the time of the Perpetual Immigrating Fund. Okay, so when Dan Jones arrives in Merthyr Tydfil, here's the situation. There are about 400 members of the church, but he, with his missionaries, and of course every member was a missionary, would bring in, during that first year he was in South Wales, 500 convert baptisms. During 1847, almost 1,000. During 1848, 1,700. And so in this three-year period, A total of 3,600 people came in the church, and it's just this little teeny place, and most of those are down around Merthyr Tydfil, Cardiff, Swansea, and Carmarthen. Now, at the end of his mission, because the folks from Liverpool didn't show up for the large conference they were supposed to release Dan Jones, he released himself. It was a logical thing, and then he actually set apart his successor, William Phillips, and his two counselors, and reorganized everything. He released himself, and it's unclear from the record whether he called for a vote of thanks for his service. Now, with such a skeleton crew of missionaries, what were the contributing factors to the phenomenal growth of the church during these years of 1846, 7, and 8? Here are a few possibilities. Over the previous several decades, the Welsh had become a nonconformist people that I was mentioning to you before: Baptists, Methodists, Congregationalists, Unitarians, Independents. There were practically no Catholics. To be Welsh was to be nonconformist, basically, by this time. Now, a high percentage of these were originally from the Church of England, and eventually they far outnumbered those who stayed with the Church of England, mainly in Cardiff and places close to the border. Now, one of the biggest enemies that we face today in missionary efforts is apathy. They didn't suffer from apathy in 1840s and 50s in Wales. It was a very important issue to determine your religion. Now, the people in Merthyr Tydfil and other surrounding areas in South Wales were immigrants from other parts of Wales, from England, and even other countries across into Europe. They'd come for the high-paying jobs in the coal mines, the iron mines, and the iron works. I say high-paying; it's relative, because if you were farming up in Carmarthenshire and you moved to Merthyr Tydfil, you could make 3 and 4 times as much working in the iron factory or coal mines, and live on a much higher level of poverty. They're still poor, but just, they had enough food to eat. But just like Tennessee Ernie Ford said, they would owe their soul to the company store, and they'd load 16 tons, and what do they get? Another day older and deeper in debt. You recall that. At least my generation will. The younger people, look it up on the internet. With an agitator like Dan Jones in this kind of environment, putting into action his irrepressible energy, his oratorical skills, and his enormous talent for publishing pamphlets in a periodical, Mormonism would not go unnoticed. It was the topic discussed and criticized, preached by the missionaries. So, welcome to Wales, welcome to South Wales, President Jones. Religious periodicals were already busy attacking the Mormons. William Henshaw was ridiculed for not being able to speak a word of Welsh, for refusing to take poison to show his belief in miracles. That sort of thing would go on. Especially active in anti-Mormon activities was the Baptist minister, the Reverend W.R. Davies, writing under various pseudonyms because he didn't want to be known. And I have been unable to find any rebuttals written by Dan Jones or any other LDS person that were sent to the periodicals before the arrival of Dan Jones. Of course, when Dan Jones wrote rebuttals, they were refused publication since they were beneath their attention. That was their most common reason. And when Dan Jones arrived in South Wales, a 32-page pamphlet entitled "The Deceit of the Latter Saints Exposed" was circulating, and this was the first printed attack on Dan Jones' pamphlet, the one that didn't even mention Mormonism or the name of the church. But why would rebuttals not be printed? Here's the answer. It would be a mockery to our nation, an insult against common sense, and stench and slime on the Star, the name of the periodical, to publish their deceit, their tricks in its pages. It is abominable to report the things that are discussed by them in their societies. They're a mockery through and through, and a curse and a plague. So, very logical reason to refuse the rebuttals written by the LDS. Okay, here's the title page of the pamphlet called "The Deceit of the Latter Saints." Well, Dan Jones fires back with a pamphlet of his own. It's called "A Glorion," the Scales in which are seen David weighing Williams and Williams weighing David, or David Williams from Aberconide contradicting himself, caught in his deceit, and proved deistic. That's the title. Question: who printed Dan Jones pamphlets? Everybody is against him. None other than John Jones. You notice that Welsh names don't have a lot of imagination to them. They're kind of recycled. But this John Jones just happened to be Dan Jones' brother, 9 years older, an ordained Congregationalist minister, and John Jones just happened to have a press at a place called Rhydybont near Llanybother, and you're all going to complain that those are unpronounceable names. Basically, that's true. Llanybother is a market town located about 50 miles from Merthyr Tydfil to the west, and one of John Jones, the minister, one of his colleagues, labeled his press the prostitute press because it lowered itself to print Mormon materials. Now, John Jones just happened to have a young typesetter by the name of John S. Davis. John Jones didn't ever convert to Mormonism. John S. Davis, however, did, and after setting the type on 3 pamphlets for Dan Jones, he got baptized. Ironically, John Jones' wife and 2 daughters decided that Dan Jones was right, and they joined the church, but not the minister. Here's a very fuzzy picture of the Rhydybont Chapel, and the house to the side is likely where the press was located. Now, this 22-year-old John Davis was absolutely amazing. Not only did he set the type for Dan Jones publications, he also became the printer. He's only 23 years old, but in 3 years he was the official printer for the church. He was the editor for the magazine, and he also translated and published the Doctrine and Covenants, the Book of Mormon, Pearl of Great Price, all in 18 months' time into Welsh. He's an amazing person. Now, the Reverend W.R. Davis, don't have a picture of him. He died of cholera in 1849. But he was a Baptist minister in the Merthyr Tydfil area. Here's a sample of his contempt for the Mormons who dared to baptize some of his parishioners. One of them is his right-hand man. I sincerely beseech everyone not to give the name of saints to this foul mob. Rather, let them be given their proper names. That is, 19th century Satanists. So that's one of the many labels that were thrown on us during that time. Now, here's just a list, give you an idea, a list of the anti-Mormon articles in one pamphlet, 20-page pamphlet that W.R. Davis came out with. Dan Jones came up with a list of his own, answered every one of them point by point, and established a periodical so that he'd have a vehicle to do that. Now, remember back just before the martyrdom, Joseph Smith said, I've got some money for you as soon as I get a check cashed. So he obviously, Dan Jones, obviously had in mind to go and use the printing press to serve his mission, which he did very effectively. But the thing that he published was this. Started off with, in 1846, July, Prophet of the Jubilee. It's a strange name for a periodical, but it has basically the history of the church in its 580 pages during this 2.5-year period. And just to give you an idea of how excited Dan Jones was to finally have a vehicle by which he could propagate Mormonism, here's what he said. Oops. Now this is it. Okay, we'll get caught up here. He says, you know how we've been accused of every evil, trickery, yes, and of every foolishness. We sent in the mildest manner, I've seen some of those and they're not too mild, but in the mildest manner, to the monthlies which accused us, letters asserting our innocence. But were they allowed to appear? No. Were we accused in the Times, the Star of Gomer, Educator, Baptist, etc.? Yes. Was space provided for us to clear ourselves? No. Rather, every poor excuse was sought. Is the press locked against us? Is that the freedom of Wales in the 19th century? Have the monthlies been locked? We shall open our own monthly then. Has the press been polluted by libeling us? We shall cleanse it by defending ourselves then. And that's what he did with Prophet of the Jubilee, because that finally was a vehicle. He didn't have to wait for them to print his rebuttals, because they never would. He'd write his own materials in his own periodical, and the work went forward very well. Yeah, here's a blind man by the name of Daniel Jones, was baptized in 1846. His plan, with the help of Josiah Thomas Jones, who was a Congregationalist minister, was for him to get baptized, ask a blessing, and then to cure his blindness. And since the Mormons would fail in doing that, then he could claim that Mormonism was false. But it backfired, because while he was there receiving this blessing from Abel Evans and Dan Jones, he says, in the hearing of all that were in the room and peering in the windows from outside, "'Tis enough, I can see the candle in the candlestick on the table." And that got everybody really excited. But later he denied having said that. Minister, this Josiah Thomas Jones, helped him to write a pamphlet entitled "The Correct Image," wherein one can perceive clearly the deceit of the Mormons. And he had this catchy ballad in there as well. People would sing as they walked along the street. Okay, so Dan Jones never went without responding. Here's his response. A pamphlet entitled "Haman, Hanging from His Own Gallows." This is evoking the image of Haman of the Old Testament, who'd ordered a gallows built, remember, to where Mordecai, Esther's uncle, was to be hanged. But tables turned. Eventually the king ordered Haman and his co-conspirators to be hanged from that gallows. So the parallel is that the blind man and Josiah Thomas Jones, his minister friend, were laying this trap, but nope, lo and behold, the blind man is the one that suffers, and this is how he did. Several months after the baptism and the blessing, Dan Jones told the blind man that if he didn't stop persecuting the church, he would suffer a fate hotter than that of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Remember the three that fought against Moses. They were swallowed up in the earth. Shortly thereafter, the blind man contracted an illness that caused him to cry out that he was burning up alive. In a letter published in Millennial Star, Dan Jones wrote, his friends, the blind man, poured cold water on him night and day in vain. He would rush out from them to a pool nearby, and there he would roll and wallow and yelp until he terrified the passers-by. And so Jones commented on the blind man's death later on that he died a monument of the displeasure of a just God for hypocrisy. Then later on, let's see, what do I have here? Yeah. When a convert named Thomas Jones apostatized, out comes a pamphlet. Remember, he wrote 37 of them during his time, plus all the stuff in Prophet of the Jubilee, defending everything about Thomas Jones, why he left the church, why he was not allowed back in when he wanted to be. And so here's the title page of that pamphlet. Now, occasionally, Dan Jones' detractors would later become admirers. Here's an example. Thomas John, 35-year-old single man, was one of the first group of the Welsh Mormons to come across in 1849. He left the faith, but then he finds himself back in Wales. He wants to come back into the fold, and so he writes a letter, an open letter to Dan Jones. "I'm very sorry for having said even one bad thing against you, and I earnestly beg your forgiveness, the forgiveness of the saints and the forgiveness of God, so that I can come back to his church, the only place where there's eternal life." So a lot of people didn't like Dan Jones, like him, as Thomas John, but they want to come back into the church, so they write this letter of apology, which was published in the Zion's Trumpet. Let's see. Oh, yes. In one of his many attacks on the Mormons, the Reverend W.R. Davies, the Baptist minister, recommended that the reader consult the Baptist periodical entitled The Baptist for other witnesses of the untruthfulness of Mormonism. And the following is just a small part of Dan Jones' reaction, his response, and it's my favorite quote from among his many phrases in a polemic fashion. He asks, is this referring to the Baptist periodical, not the sinkhole into which you have spewed the contents of your foul insides for years, and would you wish us to sully our noses again in your stinking liquid? That was, yeah, there it is. Yeah, that was his response. But in contrast, here's one of my favorite segments of his English phraseology contained in a letter to Orson Pratt in 1849. Dear President Pratt, After a fortnight's constant pressure business which beset my little bark like a raging tornado, I at length find time enough to report that I am still afloat and seaworthy with my colors nailed to the masthead. He was ready to work, and he was a fighter, and he didn't give up. He died at age 51, unfortunately, buried in the Provo City Cemetery. In conclusion, I've given only a woefully incomplete and fragmented portrait of the missionary Dan Jones, but further information can be obtained in the English translations of over 2,000 pages of his writing that are now available. Prophet of the Jubilee, his pamphlets in Defending the Faith, various volumes of Zion's Trumpet, all now available. Now, I gather from his writings that Dan Jones was a very feisty and even pugnacious person, didn't pull any punches. His conversion to Mormonism, however, was solid. Apparently, he never wavered. He never received the money for the Maid of Iowa, but he went on his mission and served with distinction. The leaders from Liverpool did not show up for his final conference in Merthyr Tydfil as promised, but he simply released himself, set apart his successor and counselors. He brought a group of 330 Welsh Mormons to America. 20% of them died of cholera. 82 of the group continued straight to Salt Lake City. All but 2 voted for Dan Jones' suggestion that they set up a separate Welsh but still Mormon kingdom west of Salt Lake City with Elizabeth Lewis as queen. Yes, that's what Isaac Nash, who later became a patriarch, said, and I think I believe him. You can see my website for the full story. George A. Smith talked him out of the idea of having a separate kingdom, and Dan Jones later became the first mayor of Manti. Returned to Wales in 1852 to serve a second mission, was again highly successful in gaining an additional 2,000 converts. Now, some people in Wales and in Utah accused him of some very serious wrongdoing, and after hearing Jones's side of the story, his leaders gave him their support, and he refused to let such things shake his belief in Mormonism. His testimony was rock solid. Thousands of Welsh converts and their descendants are glad that he remained afloat and seaworthy and with his colors nailed to the masthead. Thank you very much. Question: did Dan Jones have any connection to Welsh converts that became members of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir? Yeah, we did a documentary on the choir a number of years ago with the BBC. We asked all the members of the choir that had Welsh ancestry to raise their hands. 3/4 raised their hands, yes. And the first conductor of what became the Tabernacle Choir was John Perry, that was in the 1849 group, and it was the nucleus was this small group of 82 LDS. Half of those were children, so you had a small group that became members of the choir. It was very awkward because to sing English, they didn't know how to sing English, and the Americans that were part of the choir didn't know Welsh. I don't know how he worked it out, but somehow he did, and we have today the Tabernacle Choir. Prior to the translation into Welsh, the Book of Mormon, did it play any role in missionary work? It did, but people couldn't read it because it was in English. But yes, it did play a role. They had copies, and they would talk about it and use it as a missionary tool. In a nutshell, what's the significance of Benbow Farm? Yes, Benbow Farm has a nice plaque. It's where Wilford Woodruff spent a good part of a couple of days clearing away everything so he could do his baptisms, and he reports that he baptized all but one of 600 members of the United Brethren. That's Benbow Farm, which is over in Herefordshire, not too far away from the border of Wales. Was Dan Jones ever called to early leadership in the church? No. Why or why not? Because he was called on a mission, and that's what he wanted to do, and that's what Joseph Smith wanted him to do. He was a leader over there, but not back here. All those leadership roles are pretty well filled up. Did Dan Jones answer or respond to negativity in regards to polygamy? No, but he himself had 3 wives, 2 children by each that survived. But yes, he supported that. It was hard for him in 1853, that's when it broke, and he had a series of articles in the magazine explaining the Mormon position on on polygamy. Is the pollster Dan Jones a descendant of this Dan Jones? Negative, just coincidence. As I said before, the Welsh had no imagination in names. They're all recycled, and it's just coincidence. You got more? Two more. Okay. Pronoun da. Growing up in Wales, I can... Pronoun means good afternoon. Growing up in Wales, I can tell you that Wales is a country, not a principality. This is an English myth. You're welcome there. It's all how you cut it. Dan Jones, how did he die? He died of the lung disease caused, I think, by working in the lead mines. He complained about that over the years. His posterity, not like some. He just had 2 children by each wife, 6 children, and probably a modest number of descendants. What seemed to be the central accusation that fired at the Welsh against the Mormons, that miracles was the focal point. They claimed to work miracles. William Hughes' leg he received a blessing and his leg got better and the doctor was amazed, that sort of thing. And they say, no, that didn't happen. Go back and forth, and that was one of the main things was healing and also miracles and angels and things like that, just the common stuff that you've all heard about. I do have a small anecdote. Can I tell just an anecdote?
Sure.
Okay. This is how did the Welsh deal with having names all the same? And the way they did that was either add a middle initial or they would attach it to what they did. Like if you were a hairdresser, well, you'd be Jones the hair. If you were a butcher, well, it was Jones the meat. And there's a story told about a person that worked for CIA that was to be dropped into Wales and to find somebody named Jones, and the code was the daisies bloom in the spring. So he was dropped into Wales, took off his parachute, folded it up, and saw a man. He said, "Are you Jones?" He says, "Yes, I am." He said, "The daisies bloom in the spring." And he thought, and he says, "Oh, wait a second. If you go into the village, it's the second door on your right. There's where Jones the spy lives."
Thank you very much.